This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. Pleasure to be with you, as it always is. I'm on Gadigal country tonight. Gee, do I tempt our summer operas with the tantalising drip feed of updates on our t-shirt situation? Oh. Maybe I'll just leave it there. But you could be hearing more of the old t-shirt to and fro.
T-shirt production corner makes its triumphant return.
Well, that's not quite how I would describe it just yet.
Take a back seat, Easy Street Murders. History's greatest cold case has suddenly reached a breakthrough.
What was I thinking?
Frankie, the thing that really amuses me is the fact that you could have been listening to this podcast for over a year and have no idea what we're talking about.
That's true.
And indeed, I heard, breaking in here, from a recent listener, recently begun listener, that the podcast is good, but there's a bafflingly high level of in-jokes to wade through before getting to the stuff they were told would be there.
Is there too much TLDR on the old T-shirt front, though? Not really. We're thinking about some T-shirts. We've been thinking about it for a while. Principally, that's been my responsibility, and so nothing has happened. But I'm setting about fixing that, and we may have more to say about that over the next few weeks.
Previously in T-shirt production corner. Right. Thanks, Frankie.
Oh, no.
All right. Lest we be waylaid by in-jokes on my way to completing the introductions to this podcast, we are also joined by a man fresh from cosplaying on the exhibition floor of the PAX Gaming Convention in Melbourne, where I can only assume the heads-up display in his futuristic wraparound sunglasses was scanning constantly for evidence of Australia's carbon leakage review, but to no avail. Tennant Reid. Good day, Tennant.
Yes. Well, if there had been a carbon leakage review second report on the floor of the PAX Australia Games Convention, I would have had no bloody idea because I could not see bupkis in my cyber shades. They were dim, they were unprescription, they were deeply uncomfortable, and they were therefore the perfect representation of the cyberpunk commitment to aesthetic over practicality. So
I did enjoy, Tennant, when you demonstrated to me at the PAX Gaming Convention what you needed to do to see, which was tip your head towards the ceiling and look under your glasses.
Yes, that's right. Didn't look very punk when doing that, I am sure.
I bet that made for some quality interactions on the floor of the old convention centre there.
Well, surprisingly, when you seem like a cyborg weirdo in a threatening motorcycle jacket, people mostly don't come up to talk to you, even at a cosplay-filled PAX convention. But Super Summer Operas may get a chance soon to see a super cool photo of the result of all this blindness and discomfort.
All right. Get on that. Patreon.com/Let Me Sum Up.
You don't be too enthusiastic about that endorsement there, mate.
It is actually a great photo.
Yeah.
It is. It's awesome.
But we should move on for the confused novice listeners have stumbled in to this podcast. On this week's show, we take a look at some recent analysis from the Institute for Energy, Economics and Financial Analysis, which looks at how much fossil gas Australia is actually going to need to see us through this energy transition. But first, zero emissions road freight has long been earmarked as an arena in which alternatives to batteries such as hydrogen fuel cells could play a big role. However, a new report from Bloomberg New Energy Finance finds the cost of battery electric trucks is falling moving fast, and it could be tough for fuel cell trucks to keep up. Frankie, glancing through this report, it is hard not to come away with the impression it would be a brave call to bet against batteries for road freight, right?
Yes, which, I guess if you're not paying attention to this particular area day in, day out, I was a bit surprised by. There is much discussion and hype locally, it seems, when you're talking about the more medium and heavy truck end of the transport spectrum for the idea and early pilot of hydrogen fuel cells. Even just the reality of where the market is today, I was really surprised by that.
Yeah.
Pleasantly so. It feels like, certainly the read out of this report, if you had no more time than a couple of sentences, would very much be battery electric trucks are looking almost a sure bet for dominating this market into the future. And so the report that we've had a glance through was produced by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, interestingly commissioned by the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, and in partnership with an outfit called the Smart Freight Centre, who are, by the looks of it, a global not-for-profit focused on climate action in the freight sector. And so it steps out. The market is very nascent and the adoption of these trucks is pretty patchy across the world. But there's a big China story in this as well. And we talk numbers for just a second. You've got 38,000 trucks sold globally in the first half of 2024. So this is zero emissions trucks. So just over 1.5% of total sales. So still tiny, pretty nascent. Yeah. But over 80% of that is in China.
So elsewhere, they're really nowheresville.
Really nowheresville. And that's useful context because China and the US are the biggest markets globally. I think between them, they account for just under a quarter of total truck fleets, I think. But anyway, of those vehicles, battery electric trucks accounted for over 90% of them, which again, if you're not paying attention to it and you see a lot of news and marketing about hydrogen fuel cells here for that end of the spectrum, it was really surprising. So China dominates both markets, batteries and fuel cells, and it looks as though the fuel cell use is also tied to use of grey hydrogen where, it's produced as an industrial byproduct. So pretty astonishing that we're going to see this growth. And Bloomberg reckons that by the end of 2030, battery packs for trucks could cost as low as $88 per kilowatt hour, more than cost competitive, with the equivalent of diesel trucks over those distances. So they're sort of saying these trucks are already becoming economically competitive with the equivalent diesel version on shorter routes. By the end of the decade, even long-haul battery trucks could reach that total cost parity. So that's really exciting, but we're coming from a really low base on the rollout. So this report had some interesting ideas around a bit of a stock take of the policies that are being announced to support uptake. And I think importantly, the big piece here as well is the supporting infrastructure for charging. Probably some novel ideas to think about in terms of partnerships around rollout for not just the fleets, but the refueling or the charging stations that go along with it.
I couldn't help reading this and think about this in the context of the broader battery revolution. Mm-hmm. We've talked before about learning rates and as you ramp up production, kind of the spillover effects that occur. What we're seeing in terms of the investment in battery technology for passenger vehicles, that being aligned and supporting broader applications of batteries, particularly for grid stabilisation and the like, it appears here in the context of freight, which was not something that anyone expected. But when you get those learning rates moving, all kinds of interesting things can happen, and things that sort of on paper, using perhaps conservative assumptions, like you squint and look at it and go, well, that'll never work. Well, actually, when you're not necessarily relying for all the investment and innovation to occur within a particular subsector, but you're benefiting from investments that are made in an adjacent subsector, all kinds of interesting things become possible and can happen very quickly.
Yeah. That positive dynamic of many sources of demand contributing to growth in production and installed capacity and learning-based cost reductions, and that opening up more niches where more demand is relevant and able to be satisfied, that is clearly starting. Well, it's happening in battery land, and heavy trucks are a teensy part of that at the moment, but could become a much larger part. It's also notable that is just failing to happen so far for hydrogen, not just in the truck space, but the whole, rather than multiple sources of demand creating a sort of rising tide of hydrogen cost reduction, use cases are kind of falling away. Light vehicle demand has failed to eventuate. Heavy vehicle demand is so far very, very teensy. And, I mean, we've also seen recently some of the heavy industry demand that had looked like it was in the pipeline start to get some question marks over it. The Australian project that Origin Energy was involved with to supply hydrogen for ammonia making. Origin's walked away from that, I think, as part of a broader reassessment of what areas of business they're involved in. And there's been some reporting that German steelmaker ThyssenKrupp is looking to at least radically change and maybe back away from completely the hydrogen-based steelmaking project that was going to be, intended to be, producing 2 megatons a year of green steel in Germany from just 3 years from now. And so when nothing is happening to a first approximation, or at least not happening yet, you're not getting any of these learning-driven, deployment-driven, scale-driven cost reductions. You're not opening up more niches. Suddenly, people who thought they might consider using hydrogen are reconsidering that because nobody else is piling in with them. And that could be a self-reinforcing negative dynamic.
Mm. Well, so you'd have to tie the future of any prospect for hydrogen fuel cell trucks to the broader growth of the hydrogen industry, green hydrogen, that is. We're focusing on climate. And so the timeframes for that look a lot longer than what we're already seeing on the battery front. And there's like super interesting innovations that come up when you're on that kind of deployment curve and you're seeing costs come down. Like some of the stuff I find really interesting is the idea of battery swap outs and almost like the extra kind of aftermarket value of vehicle batteries that could be used in stationary applications. So they mean that they retain some value at the end of, I guess, the service life that they might see in the vehicle itself. Some of the kind of perceived barriers of battery the heavy, how's that going to work on long haul routes when it's going to take too long to charge, and like that's just not going to work with the trucking industry that we've got. Well, you're starting to see these cool solutions pop up for being able to swap these batteries out, and battery chemistry is evolving pretty rapidly too. So they've talked about energy density making real gains, and that'll have implications for weight, which will have implications for battery use potentially in a whole bunch of other applications too, right? So super exciting. Like, you just wouldn't be betting against that in this sector, certainly.
I am once again reminded of the Future of Gas report we reviewed back in mid-2023, and I can't remember who made this statement, but it has stuck with me, effectively saying that electricity has been competing with hydrogen as an energy carrier for about 150 years, and electricity has cleaned hydrogen's clock every single time. And I don't see any signs of that trend abating anytime soon.
Maybe with an honourable exception for rocketry. This is a distinction without a difference. It's completely irrelevant to our actual circumstances. But on the day, we're recording on the day when SpaceX's latest launch of the Starship achieved notable success with some of its least likely to succeed elements. So who knows? Although they're not using hydrogen, they're using natural gas. Happy days. So I do have one extra thought on this, just to go the other direction from the very negative Nelly view I was just providing on hydrogen trucks prospects, which is it is still super early days for zero emissions trucks in the global fleet. It is not unimaginable that while battery electric has dominated the first teensy fraction of sales that have gone for zero emissions trucks, that hydrogen could come roaring back as ZEV trucks go from not much to quite a bit of the market. They haven't got any wind in their sails at all as of now, but maybe Nikola in the US will come good on people seem to like the very small number of trucks that they've provided. If some of these US Inflation Reduction Act supported hydrogen production projects finally get going, and the truck maker isn't having to also provide mobile hydrogen production facilities to its customers, but can start to rely on some infrastructure from others, maybe.
So I've got a thought in response to that, but it's more of a question, I think, as well. So given so much of the early market share of this is in China, if one of these two technologies wins China, does that then win the world? And the accompanying thought I have with that is that it's not just about, the truck itself. It's about the supporting infrastructure that goes along with it. As a country like that, of course, it has its own battery supply chain, but that supports a lot of standardization in the use of batteries and charging infrastructure facilities. So there's likely to be quite a bit of economies of scale in the rollout of that. And it's not to say that couldn't still happen on the hydrogen front, but that's what they're observing in China. So if you get to a certain point where it's really dominating China, do we think that would then translate to world domination?
I think in one sense, maybe not. So that the truck market seems to be less globalized than the light vehicle market. It seems like transport costs, shipping costs of heavy trucks are a bigger deal, and there's more scope for in-market manufacturing and certainly customization. And so, if specific Chinese truck makers were all out hell for leather on BEV, that might not drag along their counterparts in other markets. But probably it does, in fact, mean where goes China, so goes the world in another sense, which is China is driving. Others are contributing for sure, but a huge amount of what is driving down the cost of batteries is taking place in China, and that's going to keep happening. And other countries trying to get in the game of batteries is going to reinforce that it's all happening in batteries dynamic, whether or not they succeed in taking market share away from China. And so if there's cheap, high-performance batteries going around, that is pretty bullish for BEV trucks and just so much else besides.
I just feel like the battery revolution is baked in, and that's a wave that's coming, and freight vehicles just need to catch it. That's both in terms of, the actual the cost curve and of battery production, but also the infrastructure that's going to be, rolled out in countries around the world. There has to be a parallel and equally impressive trend on the hydrogen side of things across both infrastructure and technology for it to be plausible that it catches it at any sort of scale. So anyway, the story's still to be written, but yes, I think this is a sobering read for fuel cell boosters.
They've been sober for a while now, I fear.
Maybe they need a drink. Shall we chat about a report?
Yeah.
The 2024 Integrated System Plan from AEMO included some updated projections, as well as some interesting commentary about the role of fossil gas in the future energy system. In particular, AEMO noted it expects gas use for electricity generation to trend downwards over the next decade, before rising from the mid-2030s. This projection has added fuel to the debate over whether, counterintuitively, running a high-penetration renewable energy system requires expanding the supply of fossil gas. But how seriously should we take these projections, and what is the broader context? These are the questions taken on in a new paper from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, titled How Much Gas Does the Future Grid Need? In it, author Jay Gordon steps through the assumptions that underpin the gas generation projections in the 2024 ISP, the various ways these projections could be wrong, and the significance of gas use for generation relative to other sources of gas demand across the economy. Tennant, this is a short report, but it provides plenty to chew over. What did you make of it?
So I thought that this report, it steps into an area where people are constantly taking bits and pieces of the material published by AEMO and others and saying that whatever that fragment says proves that they were always right about everything they always thought about gas. And IEFA do, for a pretty opinionated organisation, I think in this paper they do a very good job of giving a sense of what the moving parts are behind the projections and what the roles of gas are. There's a couple of judgments and implications that I didn't quite agree with. But overall, I thought it was a really fair and useful corrective to some of the spin that we see. So, they're clarifying what the actual role in the ISP, the Integrated System Plan, of gas-powered generation is, which is increasingly as backup for renewables droughts rather than as a bulk source of generation, and even starting to diminish in its role as a source of daily flexibility for the grid. They cite some reporting of the ISP or industry organisation responses to the ISP which really vigorously talk up the role of gas generation in it without ever quite acknowledging that that role is volumetrically small.
Yes, well, there was a pretty remarkable release from peak body Australian energy producers that basically framed gas as the load-bearing central pillar of a renewable powered economy. And this report from IEFA reads a bit like the crew over there saw that release and were like, how are you wrong? Let me count the ways.
It's pretty galling, though. Like, you could be criticised for selectively quoting, but actually this media release from the, which outfit is it? Oh, yeah, Australian Energy Producers. Like,
the artist formerly known as APIA.
Yeah. The quote that gets me is that the ISP makes clear that gas will play an increasingly important role in keeping the lights on for Australian households and businesses. It follows AEMO's warning last week of potential gas shortages in Victoria, with gas demand surging as a result of cold weather and reduced wind outputs. Like, that's being pretty cheeky.
Gas producers release media release saying gas is great.
We need more gas. Gas.
Hold the front page.
More gas, please.
But, so this is the area where things do get tricky, though, because, so in the ISP, gas-powered generation is meeting somewhere between 5% and 1% of annual electricity demand through the 2040s. And like that ain't big as a volume. It's also like that generation is playing quite an important role, if small in volume, in meeting overall reliability expectations and serving as insurance against renewable droughts. And so, like, I think the things that aren't said in that APIA release are pretty unfortunate, because it could easily be misconstrued as saying we need more and more and more output from and fuel going into gas peakers, and even implying that there's going to be a coal to gas switch, which that does not make economic sense at all. But a thing can be small and important, and the debate doesn't often leave room for that. I think IEFA do quite well in walking that line.
I think they make a really good point in, they call out that this is a lot of new capacity that the ISP says that we may need to build 15 gigawatts or thereabouts. But they also say, like, that will need to be investable as well, because people building these gas generators are going to operate increasingly less frequently over time. So if you think it's expensive to run gas peakers now, like, I imagine those economics don't necessarily get any better if they're operating even less of the time into the future.
Yeah, and either they sort of frame that as caveat emptor, or, well, caveat buildor to people thinking of investing in gas generation. I think for all the rest of us, there's think carefully here, because the ISP, it does rely on a bunch of gas peakers to meet an important portion of reliability. If those are uninvestable under current market structures and policy structures, it's not enough to just say, think twice before building one. If we need them built, then how are we going to get them built? And there's a bunch of policy options for that, including the capacity mechanisms that were being debated a couple of years ago. But without something, and something that addresses the fears that people have had about any kind of capacity mechanism, government underwriting, whatever it might be for gas peakers or things that quack like them, the fear that that will increase emissions and encourage coal generators to hang around longer than they should or operate more often than they should, and more output then is really needed from gas generators without both the investable policy and the confidence in emissions budgets being met. We're not going to see this part of the ISP get built, and I think operating without insurance is a bad idea in almost any context.
There's two, I guess, targets in terms of introducing some contestation into the plausibility of gas infrastructure investments. And one is certainly the gas peakers themselves, but another is an investment in new supply infrastructure. That part of the conversation is really supported quite well by sort of unpacking the amount of gas demand that is allocated to gas power generation relative to other parts of the economy. And it's pretty small. LNG exports are huge. Industrial is big. Residential and commercial buildings, big-ish, but diminishing over time in the available projections. But in the context of all of that other demand, the actual gas that we're using for generation is pretty tiny. And so in terms of, people in the business of extracting gas and piping it around the country, looking at the projections that gas is going to play some role in a future renewable energy system, saying, well, that means we need to tap into new gas supply. It's like whether that is actually true will be much more driven about what happens around export markets, industrial demand to a degree, buildings, but a bit less so. Much, much more than whether, there's a slight uptick or downtick in terms of gas power generation in a given year in 10 or 15 years, right?
Yeah. And the other awkward thing there is that when the much discussed, not super often observed, widespread renewables drought actually happens, then you go to needing maybe 15 gigawatts of generators operating continuously for like a week, needing fuel to run on, and very high flow rates of fuel required. And the report notes the changes that took place from the draft to the final version of the 2024 integrated system plan around this question of implausibly high flow rates and the alternative of more gas or more fuel, maybe diesel fuel, being stocked away on site or very close by to these generators so that when they are called on for the heroic big push, when everything else has failed, they can actually do it. And investing in long-distance pipelines and new production just for those once-in-a-blue-moon needs may not be nearly as attractive as storage.
They also do, I think, a pretty good job at stepping through the competition that these generators are going to face over the next little while. And we've revisited this. We've talked about this topic a few times over a few different episodes of this pod, and I know we keep identifying that small and it seems ever increasingly small role for something that quacks like a peaker. But the conversation we just had at the top of the pod is relevant to this too, in terms of the role for gas, that could be occupied by batteries as as their costs decline. I know we're really talking about the peak of the peaks, that you'd be using these generators for. But the growth of that technology and the cost curve that it's on with learning rates could suggest, a bigger role for batteries compared to this than we might have seen previously. And the other thing, it also talks about the other storage technologies like pumped hydro and stuff, but it also pleasingly talks a bit about demand management too. Like these crazy folks at IEFA seem to think that doing things to shift demand away from peak times might actually get a look in.
Crazy talk.
I know. Probably been listening to a little too much LMSU, but we love to see it.
Oh yes, we should definitely claim credit for that, Frankie.
Sorry, AIFA, I did not presume that we've influenced you in that way. But it'd be nice to think, wouldn't it?
Well, so those alternative flexible approaches and technologies, like they genuinely are terrific, and some of them will prove to be a little more terrific in some contexts than others. But they are going to devour, like especially batteries, but also various kinds of smart demand management are going to devour a large share of the flexibility services that gas currently provides. I am much less convinced that they are going to displace much of this backup role, because the hallmark of the backup role is that you almost never need it, and then when you need it for a while. And the almost never bit makes anything very capital intensive a poor fit, and the last for a while makes a lot of demand side stuff a poorer fit too. The flex that people might be willing to provide for, a couple of hours on the hottest day or the coldest day of the year as an emergency thing, I think if that lasts for a week, it's hard to distinguish that from being blacked out, or at least for a portion of your demand. I don't think that's a great fit, but that sort of intensifies this financial or market design or policy design challenge. The more that the role of peakers really is just backup, and there's not much revenue to be made from anything else, the less investable they are in the absence of some new mechanism.
I did a webinar today for a bunch of financial advisors, people without a background in energy that are trying to get across the basics. And in the chat after my presentation, they're just throwing questions out there. And one of this is like they've picked up this re-emergence of the idea of gas as a transition fuel, which is hotly contested for all kinds of very reasonable reasons. The answer I had to give is that it's entirely contextual, right? Like in many contexts in the economy, and, Frankie and I bang on about this all the time, like low temperature heat, particularly in buildings, it's crazy pants to say that gas is, got any sort of plausible role.
Well, it's part of the very extended transition over a century and a half from heating your house with coal to
the Mad Max hellscape.
That's right.
Well, that transition may be going a little faster than we'd like, but yes.
But in other contexts, and like the one that you're talking about, the very judicious use of gas until a better solution comes up, it actually is possible to say that it is a genuine enabler for a high penetration renewable energy system, which will be incredibly low emissions relative to the system that we have now, relative to any benchmark that you care to choose. And we're used to kind of like, being able to say very categorically, for example, when it comes to coal, like there isn't really an application for coal in a net zero economy. Like you can just say coal bad, go away, we don't need it. But when you need a little bit of gas and it's not something that you can be completely black and white about, I think that's quite hard for people, particularly when there's people running around that are kind of trying to overinflate that role. It's quite nuanced, right? And nuance is tough in this space.
787 Dreamliners, a terrific way to get from Australia to the United States, not therefore necessarily a terrific way to get to the supermarket. But that's the level of depth of argumentation that is applied on the topic of natural gas all too often.
I liked the content in this report around, digging into what we can actually expect from, droughts of variable renewable energy.
Yeah.
And they reference this paper from Tim Nelson and friends, sort of looked at all these historical weather data and tried to map it on a high penetration renewable energy system. And they found that the worst conditions in 42 years would have resulted in an M-wide decrease in output over 2 weeks of 30% from otherwise expected levels. So that's not nothing.
No.
That's something that you really need to manage, but it's not energy Armageddon. It provides some context for the task we have before us. If that's the worst thing that happens in 42 years, and obviously our climate is changing, and it's hard to project forward based on historical weather data. Need to make that caveat because we do have a very geographically diverse, interconnected electricity system on the east coast of Australia. We're managing that risk across multiple systems, and plausibly it reduces the likelihood that we're going to have really, really significant issues on that front.
Yeah, the Nelson Gilmore Nolan paper was like, I gave it a skim, and it was pretty interesting. The shorter the period you looked at, the greater the extent of historic variability. But yeah, over that 2 week lasting sort of drought period, 30% is something you can build towards being able to supply, and 15 gigawatts of peakers would certainly cover that. A point that is made well by IEFA, if you have, by whatever policy hook or crook, that 15 gigawatts, renewables droughts turn out to be worse or more common than is thought, you don't therefore necessarily need more gigawatts. You just need to run those that capacity for longer. You do need to sort out whatever the hell it is you're going to burn in the things and have that available. But some dimensions of the problem don't keep scaling up.
And what did you two make of, there's kind of like a gentle but consistent critique throughout this document of AEMO's assumptions about gas generation. At the core is that they keep bouncing around from ISP to ISP. They're also that they make a range of other critiques along the journey in terms of broader gas market conditions, both locally and globally. I mean, to a degree, like, modelling is based on assumptions, almost all of which are contestable, which is not a news flash. But do you think that the implication there's something particularly wrong with AEMO's assumptions in this space holds up?
I mean, I would zero in on the piece around demand. Historically, assumptions around flat profile and not delving into the kinds of things you then might generate policy for and start to shape a response around when it comes to the demand management piece of the equation. But like we've talked about that previously, I also think it's sort of a bit rough on AEMO to, criticise them for updating their assumptions, because that's the very purpose of doing this exercise every couple of years. And, the situation changes and they're updating their view as they go along. Like I think I lean to be a little bit kinder in my assessment of them but I do think some of those structural pieces could be looked at a little better.
I think that the gas peaker piece of the ISP, it does bounce around a lot. And it sort of reminds me of the scene in little-loved Matrix sequel, The Matrix Reloaded, where Neo stumbles into the metaphysical lair of the ultimate white man who's been directing everything in the Matrix all this time, and asks him, "Why am I here?" and is told, "Your life is the sum of a remainder of an unbalanced equation inherent to the programming of the Matrix. You are the eventuality of an anomaly, which despite my sincerest efforts I have been unable to eliminate from what is otherwise a harmony of mathematical precision." I think that is very much what like a Neo representation of gas would be told if it stumbled into the heart of the AEMO ISP modelling system. The architect there would say, well, you are the fudge factor that helps make all the rest of it stack up, and we can't quite eliminate you yet, much though we try without...
You are a function of whatever gap we have in our our model this particular year.
Pretty much.
And sooner or later, a vast swarm of battery-powered biomechanical squids is going to eliminate the gas resistance. That metaphor may have just gone too far. Anyway, I think it is messy. I don't think it's possibly what I just said made it sound very sinister. It's not, but it is a messy remainder.
And it's important to say that their analysis sort of pointing out that this bounces around a lot and, you know, it's very uncertain and, you know, there could be plausibly a much lower role for gas peakers in a couple of years. It seems to be really focused on taking out a bit Sharpie and underlining it for anyone considering investing in this stuff. That would probably not be the best idea, which takes you full circle back to your initial point, Tennant, which is, well, if we need a bit of it and nobody's confident to invest in it, like where does that leave us collectively? And do we find ourselves in the uncomfortable place of actually having to underwrite it? Because it is the enabler for the high penetration renewable energy system, which I think many people would be unhappy with.
Much like the Matrix sequels.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
I have a depressingly insane sequel to the reference we made last episode, that I made, to people on the nut right end of the US political cultural spectrum taking a turn against solar radiation management geoengineering as a plot to vaccinate the climate, control the weather and maybe people's thought patterns. That line of thinking went even further recently and continued its emergence into wider political and cultural consciousness with the boomlet in people, including elected politicians, opining that recent mega hurricane Milton that caused a very great deal of damage and some loss of life in Florida was a geoengineering product deliberately steered towards Florida for obscure political motives and possibly to make lithium supplies more easily acquirable. It's too early to tell whether this will be a new theme with every natural disaster that strikes the United States, but things are moving rapidly in the geoengineering anti-fandom, so watch this space.
Or not.
Watch out for this space.
Yeah, maybe.
Flee with all possible speed from this space.
I'll choose option C, Mr. Reed.
Okay.
All right. Frankie, save us. What have you got?
Oh, I'm not sure I'll do that. But I also have a sequel of One More Thing, because I think the last time we got together, I was, telegraphing that the Australian government was about to host a global nature summit, which did in fact happen last week in Sydney. And what was not launched at that summit, but was quietly released today, the week after the summit, was the government's 30 by 30. So the pathway to protecting and conserving more of our land by 2030. You could look at that and go, wouldn't that have been a good thing to release during the Global Nature Positive Summit? And they obviously didn't do that. And I've only skimmed it, but it doesn't read, I think, unfortunately, as an overly strategic document. So there's a couple of the sort of big things you look for, right? Like, what is the clear set of flagship actions that is going to underpin those efforts? Doesn't really have anything like that. It's not supported by any amount of funding. I think it's telling that it wasn't released with a media release from the relevant minister. It was just sort of posted a bit quietly to the website today. That's a little depressing. It also, I was interested to look at it to see what role it envisioned for the, sort of private sector investment through the nature repair market. And it gives like a very slight nod to that, but really doesn't include any sort of fulsome account of the role it's expected to play. I think there's a reason it's been released quietly the week following a nature summit. And, that's unfortunate, because we do need to focus on this. And I think last week the minister at the summit used a speech and the sort of announcement platform to talk about our efforts on the marine conservation side of things, to that 30% on the water side. Meeting and beating on those targets, because we've got a lot of water and not a huge amount of areas you would, fish from them or seek to exploit. Like, a lot of that you wouldn't be doing that activity in anyway. So look, I can't help but observe a little bit of the politics behind those things. And I think on a range of fronts it was very telling. But I will post a link to it in the show notes so you can make up your own mind about whether this is a strategic document.
Well, you too cheery.
Sorry. We didn't swap notes ahead of time.
Well,
so
I will actually save us, because I come bearing good news. We have good news for three people. If you haven't gotten around to it, we have closed out our competition for the Currently Speaking Trivia Night next Wednesday, 30th of October in Melbourne. So that's, I guess, bad news. It's also bad news for people that were just hoping to buy a ticket off their own bat, because I can report that trivia night is now sold out. So there are no further opportunities to attend.
Sounding too cheery.
However,
okay.
However, I can report that for three lucky listeners, they have received their golden tickets. Everyone will remember that to win, you had to answer a simple question: what novel strategy should Tenant employ to get the carbon leakage review second report released? And we had three winning answers. And while they all get a ticket, what I propose doing is reading these three answers out to the two of you, because we need an actual winner, right? Who will receive probably nothing, but glory ain't nothing.
Glory is everything.
Indeed. So these are brief, 25 words or less. So no, they've done a good job. Dean, writes, surely the best way is for Tennant to confidently declare on the podcast or on LinkedIn that it will never be released. So Tennant's propensity to be wrong for the win, I guess, there.
I love that.
Ben writes that Tennant should continuously stage CBAM the musical on the footpath outside the DQ offices in Canberra. So
I'd love that.
Singing Up a Storm on Alara Street. And the third winning answer on the podium is Dylan, who writes that Tennant should convince a large member organisation to announce they are leaving Australia due to policy uncertainty and lack of clarity around carbon leakage. So, what do you reckon? Who takes out the gold in this little competition?
That's a hard choice. What do you reckon, Frankie?
For mine, I really want to see CBAM the musical performed on repeat. I think that's so great and creative. And I reckon if you were an innocent bystander outside the offices of DQ, you'd think, this busker chap's pretty talented, I reckon. He's got a lot of passion for this thing called CBAM that he's singing and dancing about all day long from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, occasionally on weekends.
I'm having a vision of Tennant in the costume that Dick Van Dyke wears at the opening of Mary Poppins.
I was totally just envisioning. It's great.
So, look, I think that this is certainly the most wholesome answer. And I am happy to support it. It does seem like it might also be interpretable as me getting out the front of, or maybe out the back, the ministerial wing of Parliament House with a boombox serenading the Prime Minister's office. With a CBAM-related love song, John Cusack style, but whichever way, I think yes, the CBAM the musical must be the winner, as good as the other suggestions are.
All right. Congratulations, Ben. The winner of the competition, you get a ticket like Dean and Dylan, but you, in particular, get the bragging rights. We'll see all three of you for trivia next Wednesday night. And that is our show for today. We have a email address, mailbag@letmesumup.net, where you can send in your comments, your questions, your reports. We also have a website. Tennant, what's there?
At letmesumup.net, you can find all the widely available episodes this podcast has ever produced, but not the super special, super summer upper episodes that are on a different website. But the public stuff is great. It covers hydrogen. It covers gas. It covers negative emissions. It covers a very great many topics and reports about which you might want to know more without having to read the underlying matter. So get on over to letmesumup.net.
And this podcast was edited by energy professional and podcast tragic Mark Spencer from Here Media Studio. Frankie, how do we pay for that editing?
With the delightful, delicious, gratefully received support from you fabulous super summer uppers who have subscribed to our Patreon. I think it's worth a little bit of an applause to you guys for pitching in, because you, super summer uppers, are saving our bacon by letting us focus more time and energy, not just reading papers, but taking you on weird pop culture tangents, which you'll also happen to find plenty of content that speaks to that on our Patreon at patreon.com/letmesumup. It recently had the opportunity to pitch in for those hottest ticket in towns to the Currently Speaking trivia night coming up. But we post all kinds of awesome stuff to this Patreon on a weekly basis. We do subscriber-only episodes that you can listen to on topical things coming around. There is occasional dog and cat bonus content for you animal lovers out there. That's a recent invention. And you may yet have the promise of seeing Tennant in his cyberpunk outfit with glasses through which he cannot see. So get onto it. Patreon.com/Let Me Sum Up.
Indeed. All right. Well, for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again soon.